When we think about the Episcopal Church in the post-World War II period, we are thinking about a church that undergoes tremendous changes. One of the most obvious aspects of this is a large post-war expansion of the church. After World War II, the GI Bill permits education for returning service members. This sees a huge growth in wages and movement to suburbs. I have to note the GI Bill is only applicable to white service members and is not something that African American service members are able to take advantage of fully. And we need to consider this when we're talking about anything about the life of the Episcopal Church and church growth in the post-World War II period. This baby boom, though, that does follow because of the GI Bill and economic growth afterwards leads to significant spikes in church attendance. And this creates an anomalous bubble in membership in the Episcopal Church. And let me show you what I'm talking about. In 1940, the Episcopal Church has 2 million baptized members. In 1960, it has 3.2 million baptized members. That's a tremendous growth that's fueled mostly by infant baptism, child baptism, and not by simply a gain of new members or converting people to Christianity. This leads to significant growth in suburbs due to careful planning in several different dioceses around the country. So, for example, John Hines, when he's the bishop coadjutor of Texas, doubles the number of churches in the diocese in a 10-year period from 1945 to 1955. So, St. George's in Austin is the 5th oldest church in Austin, being founded only in 1950. The prior 4 were St. David's, Good Shepherd, All Saints, and St. James. And then there are 8 more churches planted in Austin in the 1950s through 1960s. Malcolm Riker, who's the Diocese of Texas church planter during that time, establishes churches in Austin named, for instance, after the 4 evangelists during this time period. So St. Matthew's, St. Mark's, St. Luke's, and St. John's, which you can all find in various parts of the city. During the same period of time, Seminary Southwest, where we are located, is founded in 1952. So we can envision what's happening in an Austin context as something that's also cycling out in lots of other contexts. If you come from an Episcopal church that's in a suburb, your church most likely was established sometime in the 1950s or later. Alongside this simply sheer growth in the number of people is significant theological developments that also happen. One of the significant events is the rise of neo-orthodoxy. This comes out of thinkers like Karl Barth, who attempt to reconcile an evangelical worldview with the realities of modernity and try to reconcile both the problems of personal sin and corporate sin with things like we see in the Holocaust, for instance, or racism, in light of God's sovereignty. And this leads to a real revival in the discipline of theology in the Episcopal Church during this time period. This then also leads to new perspectives and theological innovation. A real cautionary tale around this is the career of James Pike. He was the Dean of St. John the Divine Cathedral in New York City, and then later Bishop of California, which would be the San Francisco Bay Area. He delivers and composes writings and delivers talks during this time period where he appears to both reject the doctrine of the Trinity and the virgin birth. So think back to that statement by the 1925 House of Bishops on the creeds and talking about what the permissible parameters were for thinking about creedal affirmations. Pike clearly steps over the line for that. This leads in 1966 to him being brought up on heresy charges. He is censored by the House of Bishops and then resigns as Bishop of California. In 1969, he goes to Israel on a pilgrimage and dies after going on a sort of spiritual quest wandering in the Judean desert. This episode, which is called the Pike Affair, leads to a sense of crisis, theologically speaking, in the Episcopal Church in the late 1960s, early 1970s. A question of, is everything up for grabs? What is certain in theology? And a suspicion and retrenchment away from the seminary system by some bishops. Also during this time period is a new approach to theological education in general via the introduction of the practice of clinical pastoral education, or CPE. CPE develops as an exercise in chaplaincy that chaplains from World War II bring back into clinical settings in hospitals. And from their experience of trauma on the battlefield, they view it necessary for all people in formation for ordination to engage in this kind of intensive encounter with the suffering of others and with learning how to gain real pastoral skills and guiding people through the most difficult parts of their lives. This then leads to a psychological turn in pastoral care, where now the ideal role of the pastor isn't around exhortation to avoid sin and cultivate virtue and instruction in the Christian life or in catechesis, but rather into active listening and conversation that leads to the empowerment of the parishioner. We can then see how these shifts really bear out in the life of the Episcopal Church in some significant ways, and we can still see them at play today in the life of the Church. This frame, I hope, helps you then think more about the changes in life of the Church as we pivot in our next video to thinking more deeply about race and how the Episcopal Church confronts this in American society.